Welcome to the latest edition of Europe and You,
the programme with news and interviews from your MEPs in the European Parliament.
Coming up.
The campaigner who's fighting police kettling tactics in Strasbourg.
Scottish fears for the countryside.
It grows like topsy, it shuts out the grass underneath, it turns vast swathes of our countryside into essentially unusable scrub.
And in the studio, what to do about immigration at our borders? Will more EU power provide the answer?
It's an illness we would associate with the Victorian era, but tuberculosis is still a huge killer around the world. It's estimated that 1 million people die every year, and there's concern that resistance is growing to existing vaccines.
But there could be new hope on the horizon. Scientists in Oxford have been developing a new vaccine to tackle the disease, but to complete the work, they need more money. Dr. Adam Stoughton has turned to the EU for help.
TB is such an enormous global health issue, and we stand poised really on the edge of being able to make a huge difference in the form of new vaccines. The European Commission has done so much to support the development of a pipeline of new vaccines, including ours, and we really now need this additional support for a final push over the line, really, to succeed.
And Labour's Peter Skinner is one of a group of MEPs supporting their call for more funding.
This is an investment to make sure not just our health is better looked after, but that the jobs and the evolution of this science remains within inside the UK. If we weren't in this race to win, those jobs would go elsewhere. So this is actually not just to save the people's lives, but also to make sure the industry remains maintained within inside the UK and within Europe.
Hundreds of people with different types of disabilities have been marching at the European Parliament in Strasbourg. Amongst the group were several people from the UK. John Evans moved out of residential care nearly 30 years ago and pioneered the idea that people with disabilities could live an independent life.
But now he fears for the future. He says the government drive to spend less is having a huge impact on disabled people.
We are living through unprecedented times when disabled people are not getting a good deal. I appreciate the fact that other people have to take the cuts too, but it does seem that disabled people are taking a disproportionate amount of those cuts with all the welfare reforms in benefits and also the cutbacks in local authority services.
The government maintains changes to benefits will make the system simpler and enable more people to work. Cutting spending, the coalition argues, is essential in order to reduce the national deficit.
But campaigner Vaughan Bruce says there are also wider issues about breaking down barriers for disabled people across the EU.
It's all about equality for disabled people throughout Europe. That basically I should be able to go any part of the country, any part of Europe and get the same services that I have in Britain. The problem is that services in England may be different to France, maybe different to Sweden, and there's no uniformity. And what is important really is for disabled people to have uniformity, to be able to work in any country, to move into any other country, within Europe particularly, without barrier, without problems.
The picturesque Scottish countryside could be overwhelmed by useless scrubland without chemical controls. That's the nightmare scenario put forward by one MEP. The chemical azulam has been widely used for years to keep bracken under control, but now an EU committee has decided it should be banned.
According to SNP Euro MP Alan Smith, the problem is that the company which makes the formula has registered it for use on food. He agrees that it shouldn't be allowed on anything we eat, but as a weed killer, he says it's essential.
The existing legal basis on which azulam is authorised for use is as a food substance. Now, the scientific criteria for if it's authorised as a food substance is higher than as a non-food substance. So if you meet the higher food criteria, you're okay for everything else. So presently it's authorised for use on spinach for growing, And that's the authorisation that's caused problems. If it was still authorised for spinach, you could still use it for other things. But if we're using it as a bracken control agent, we need the lesser scientific authorisation. That's the one that the company now needs to go for.
Immigration has long been a hot political topic, not just in the UK, but across Europe.
The EU's international border agency Frontex was set up in 2004 to help European countries work together to tackle the problem of immigration from the rest of the world.
Now its powers are being beefed up so that Frontex can play a more effective role, but concerns remain about human rights.
Here in the studio to discuss this, we've been joined by the Conservative MEP Richard Ashworth
and German Green politician Ska Keller.
Richard Ashworth, coming to you first. What was Frontex actually set up to do?
Well, the Schengen zone was created some years ago, and Schengen, the principle of it is a borderless country, a set of countries, so that we can fulfill that ambition of the free movement of people within the European Union. That's been highly successful, but of course the success of it will only be as good or bad as the external border of that whole borderless zone. And we're learning the lessons. Over time we've found that control of that external border is stronger in some areas than others, and not least in the wealthier countries. It's easier to have the assets and resources to be able to patrol a border better than, for example, the borders in Bulgaria, Romania, Greece, and countries like that. So Frontex is a border agency. It is there to reinforce that external border.
And where do you think, up until now, Frontex has failed in that duty?
Well, quite simply because it hasn't had the resources. The way Frontex has worked up until now is that it has acted merely as an agency, in some instances providing personnel, but more likely providing advice and support to national border agencies, but most certainly only supplying assets like helicopters, like boats, when the national governments made them available to Frontex. And I, as a member of the Budget Committee, was very well aware that when those resources are in place, the flow of migrants, unlawful migrants across the Mediterranean, for example, was cut by about 60%. But illegal smugglers always knew that the national governments were going to take the helicopters and boats back, and as soon as they went, the flow resumed. So what we want to do is put those powers and those assets in the hands of Frontex so that the border can be kept with greater control.
Ska Keller, let me turn to you. We'll come to your concerns. I think you have concerns about things like human rights shortly, but do you accept that there's a need for that EU border agency as Richard described it?
Well, we think that borders shouldn't be like absolute points where nobody's allowed in or whatever. We absolutely think that people who are in need of protection, and many people are, should be able to cross in, and also other people who, for instance, look for a way of legal migration, and that should absolutely be possible. Also, the separation that we have now between legal and illegal people is mainly because we declare some people to be illegal in that sense. But I also don't think that as such Frontex mission has failed. I mean, Frontex mandate is to coordinate joint operation at the border. And we have seen that we don't really call that a success, but that whenever Frontex was in action, migration flows stopped at that area. But of course, that didn't mean that people had less reasons to flee, but they had to look for other ways. For instance, they had to take the longer trip to the Canary Islands when they couldn't go anymore to Spain. Now they have to come over Greece. Once the Greek border is fairly closed, I don't know where people have to go then, like via the Black Sea, for instance. So in a way, it has succeeded, but not really in the way that we want to see it, because still the people have to flee, they have to come some way. It's just that the ways are getting longer. And of course, there's a problem that member states, they don't provide the personnel, the equipment, etc. Now Frontex is also supposed to have own equipment, but still, I mean, the budget that Frontex has won't allow for buying any ships or helicopters. That the money's just not there. So, but for us, the main concern is really that people who are in need for protection also get this protection. And Frontex is not a protection agency, and therefore we would really like to shift the focus more, for instance, to the European asylum support office, which could help much more in Greece, for instance, where the problem that we have is that people who are in need of protection are basically put in prison, neglected, live under horrible circumstances. There, I think we have to help.
OK, well, the European Parliament has voted through plans to kind of beef up Frontex, and that should mean, we're told, that it will be able to buy things like helicopters when that goes through from the end of the year. So, Richard Ashworth, how will it make it more effective?
Well, if they have the assets, we've seen time and again that when those assets are in place, those unlawful migrant flows are stopped or hugely reduced. And let me make the point that we're not here creating Fortress Europe. We're not here to say that we will not have immigration into the European Union. We are perfectly open to immigration into the European Union on both a compassionate ground, but also on an out of economic necessity. But the phenomenon we have today is that the wealthy economies of the European Union are a magnet, which are drawing economic migrants from the Middle East, from the Balkans, from sub-Saharan Africa, from West Africa. These people are being drawn to the wealthier regions of the European Union. And it's not fair to the residents of those nations, it's not fair to the economies of those nations, it's actually not fair to those migrants to come and find in countries like Britain, Germany, France, Spain, that they are excluded. If you have a controlled rate of assimilation of people, it is much more humane way of accumulating people into the nation. But you can only do that if you have the assets in place to control your borders. And without those assets, unlawful people smugglers ship people across the Mediterranean in small boats, and the death toll has been quite appalling. Absolutely appalling. The number of people who have died being smuggled across the Mediterranean. That's quite appalling. Frontex would have stopped that.
And Scar Keller, what are your concerns with these new plans to beef up Frontex? About the human rights aspect, are there sufficient safeguards in these plans?
Well, this new mandate brings a few improvements on the human rights front. But the problems that we have already before without the beefing up are still persistent. For instance, we will now have this human rights officer who is, which I think is a good thing, and it's somebody who can look up into what happens in Frontex operations, etc. But it won't be an independent person. So it will be somebody who operates within Frontex, and we wanted to have somebody who's independent, who can also make critical points, raise issues, bring them to the public. That will not be the case. Another good thing is that now operations shall be suspended or terminated when there are serious human rights violations that are likely to be persistent. And I think this is an instrument that should be used, for instance, in Greece, where we see that migrants are really put under conditions that are by no way humane in any case. So there we see some improvements. But again, no independent supervision. Also, the Parliament has hardly any control. We get some reports once in a while. We do the budget, sure. But we don't know what's happening on the Frontex operations. We don't know what happens to people who are deported by Frontex. We really think that there is a lot of concerns, apart from the general thing that we have heard in the past, that Frontex is sending back people immediately without giving them the chance to apply for asylum. And everybody should have the right to ask for asylum, and later on you can check whatever the claim is about. But everybody needs to have the right to do that. In the past, this wasn't secured. People have been sent back, and that should not happen at all.
Where I live, in the southeast of England, we have at Calais migrants who have got in through the back door, if you like, of Europe. They've crossed, because there are no borders within the European Union, they've crossed right the way across to Calais, and there they live rough in the woods, in the forests, waiting for an opportunity to come across the channel. Now, you talk about human rights. That's no way for people to live. Those people are starving, they're living in the woods in the winter. If we have Frontex in place, those people, in a given controlled number, could have a controlled immigration policy. They wouldn't be smuggled here by people smugglers who have making profits out of people travelling over in disgraceful conditions, people having to live in woods and things like that. This wouldn't happen if we had Frontex guarding the outer border.
OK, well, we're very short of time, but I do want to ask you, Richard Ashworth, finally, the kind of long-term view of this. You talked about the drawbridge of Fortress Europe earlier. Are we failing to deal with the underlying problems that Ska Keller's alluded to here?
Well, look, you have a three-phase approach to this. The first phase is one that we've lived with in the southeast for a long time, which is beefing up the port of Dover, Calais and things like that. But actually, more intelligently, we need to look beyond that, and we need to beef up the external borders of the European Union, and Frontex is what that is all about. But actually, a longer term and the even more intelligent solution is to help support the economies in the third world so that those people don't have to live in abject poverty in the Middle East, in sub-Saharan Africa, that we can help those people live lives in dignity where they come from, and they don't feel the need to be drawn to Western economies.
Is that a sentiment you would share, Scott Keller?
Indeed, yes, I share that we should focus on reducing the need to flee, because all those people have very good reason for why they're coming here. And it's indeed true that many of them would like to stay in their home countries, but they have no possibility because of economy, because of war, poverty, climate change, whatsoever.
Well, this is clearly it's clearly not an easy subject to solve, but thank you very much for your thoughts, and we thank you both for joining us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A London woman is challenging kettling in the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. The police technique involves containing a crowd in a confined space and gradually allowing people to leave.
Lois Austin was involved in a protest in London back in 2001 when the police used kettling. She was kept in Oxford Circus for 7 hours and believes its use is simply wrong.
Containment wasn't used in such an extensive way before in the UK, so why now? There's other things the police have always done to control demonstrations. We believe, or I believe, that this is a draconian measure which is being used against protesters, and actually what it's doing is it's deterring people from coming out and protesting for fear of being kettled for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours.
Euro MP Jean Lambert is supporting Lois's campaign. She says it's infringing on people's democratic right to protest.
I think that kettling, certainly in the way it's used at the moment, is a breach of human rights. It's used as a way of quelling peaceful protest. They're bringing a case under false imprisonment. She was kept for 7 hours, without being allowed to leave. And when you have that, you've no access to toilets. That's also really humiliating for people. So it really is as if you're trying to punish people for coming out to protest.
Somerset cider brandy is getting special European status after a long campaign. The drink has been fighting for years to be allowed to use the name brandy. Now it's being given EU protected geographical status. That means only Somerset producers will be able to make it and label it as the real thing.
Graham Watson, the South West's Lib Dem MEP, has been supporting their campaign for several years, including by serving the drink to EU officials. He says it's been a hard-won battle.
We had to take on the whole armada of Spanish brandy producers. To do this, the Spanish had recruited to their cause the French and the Italians and various others, and it's taken us a long time. But it's been worth it, and I believe as a result Somerset cider brandy will be better known. I hope will be sold more widely. It's an excellent drink that I'd recommend to anybody.
Well, there's more news and interviews from your MEPs on our website. And remember, you can follow us on Twitter.
But that's all from Europe and You this time. See you again soon. Goodbye.
Goodbye.